So I'm a sort of semi-retired cyber risk management guru. I've done stuff at the cabinet level. I've done testimony for Congress, worked with NIST, did a stint with CISA, wrote a book on cyber risk management, and currently, as Nick noted, I am volunteering in the CVSS SIG, where we're working on the CVSS standard. So that's kind of me in a nutshell. UC2 and risk ruler, I'm sure, are foreign terms to everyone. UC2 is short for Uniform Confidence and Certainty. It is a estimation methodology and toolkit that I put together after my CISA stint, where I was working on critical infrastructure and risk management there. When I joined the CVSS SIG, I saw an immediate, or what I felt was an immediate overlap between the two, or joint between the two. So I put the UC2 risk ruler that is it's like a slimmed down version of the larger UC2 methodology. I put that together with CVSS, and that's how we arrived at this UC2 risk ruler for CVSS. And there are a couple of links down here that you can follow if you want more information on those. I also posted those papers on the Discord server, as well as the whole slide deck that we're going through right now. Just as a way to introduce what's going on here, kind of the purpose of this UC2 risk ruler for CVSS is to augment the numeric scores with a visualization of the underlying precision, confidence, and maturity of the score. As everyone's probably well aware, CVSS has really nice numeric value scores, but there is no mechanism in those numeric values to convey the maturity or completeness of the metrics that lie behind that score. So the objective here is to use this risk ruler as a way to enable more transparent and defensible cybersecurity decisions. And some of the key benefits include, of course, enhanced prioritization, but probably more important is the improved communication that is a result of this. It allows us to talk with people that maybe don't have a solid grounding in CVSS about these scores and what they mean. Before I get further into that, I want to stop and talk a little bit about CVSS4 and its metric groups. There are four main categories. There's base, threat, environmental, and supplemental metrics. They're all laid out in what we call a vector string, and although it's in tiny type, there's a vector string example at the very bottom of the screen here, and then I've broken that out into those different metric groups. And as you can see, there's usually, well, threat only has one metric, but the other ones have multiple metrics within them. And the first 11 are required. These are the base metrics that a vendor like Cisco, Intel, Juniper, whomever is going to be setting based on their view of a vulnerability in one of their systems. And it's important that you understand that this is from the viewpoint of the vendor who is incapable of seeing every single deployment in their customer base, nor do they have the ability to predict what threat metrics are going to, how the threat landscape is going to evolve over time. So the vendor starts us off with a set of base metrics that allows us to set a CVSS score, and then that is supposed to be matured with these additional metrics once that score is ingested in the field. So we'll take a look at this CVSS maturity model, which is in draft right now. I don't think it's going to change a whole lot, but hopefully it'll get a lot prettier than this when it's finally released. But essentially what happens here is, just as I was describing earlier, if you start at level 1, you're really just looking at base metrics. And then as you move to level 2, 3, and 4, this indicates that you're adding threat intelligence, you're adding threat and additional information about your environment, like how well is it firewalled off and that kind of thing, as well as some supplemental metrics that each level gives us more confidence that that score is not is correct for your environment. But this talk isn't about the CVSS maturity model, but it is important because the risk ruler does align with this. So most notably, the risk ruler basically follows this maturity model, but does so from bottom to top rather than top to bottom, as I showed on the previous screen. So we start down at the bottom. If you're not using CVSS at all, then you have no idea what the CVSS score is going to be. Obviously, it can be anywhere in a range from 0 to 10, because that's the range of scores that CVSS emits. But as we get up another level to our base metrics, we all of a sudden realize that, hey, you know what? From our point of view, and then I say our because I'm putting myself in the standpoint of a consumer, not just a vendor, then when CVSS, a score is released, it could actually be a range of that once we've added on all of our threat and environmental and supplemental metrics. But we don't know what that is going to be until we add those. But we can give kind of an estimate of where that's going to land. And all of this comes out of my UC2 methodology, which again, I'm not going to go too deep into that. And then the next level up, you have 5 different categories. These are actually defined explicitly in the CVSS specification. So they align with what the standard says each score should be if you're trying to translate them from a numeric score into a qualitative bin, right, of low, medium, high, or none. And then as we move up yet another notch, then we get to a point where we can essentially drop the decimal point and just look at the 11 buckets, 0 through 10, into which a score would fall. And then at the very top, we have the very precise score, which is maybe a 8.3 or something like that. So that's kind of the risk ruler in a nutshell. It's designed to say, okay, you know, we recognize that there are numeric values going on and in a metric of some sort or a measure of some sort. And how do we translate that or interpret that when we have only a few different options that we can do with the outcome? So before I move into a more concrete example, I want to note that for all the quants in the audience that are looking at all this qualitative stuff and rolling your eyes, there is something in here for you. It's very explicit. When I designed the methodology, it was designed specifically to allow some interoperability between quantitative and qualitative measures. So the ranges that you saw in that risk register can be used, for instance, in a PERT distribution to give you your min and max values. And from that, you can also derive a most likely value. And what happens is you end up with probability distributions like this that then feed into like a stochastic model, probably one of the most well-known being FAIR, although that is hardly the only quantitative model out there. So I'm not going to go into that because that's a whole subject into itself, but just know that the risk ruler does give that option to move into the quantitative realm. So the example that I put together here is a fictitious vulnerability, XYZ, has a really high base score as set by a vendor, and that's 8.6. And then after we mature that score by adding a different metrics and so forth, it comes down to a 4.2. So you got these two scores that are wildly different on the scale of CVSS, and we need some way to like think about this, and more importantly, how do we present these scores in the context of leadership? And that's where the risk ruler really shines, is it's designed to show very visually that the precision, maturity, and confidence that lays behind those scores. So if we map this to the risk ruler, we start on the right-hand side. We see the CVSS base score of 8.6, but we know that that is a base score. So we drop down to the maturity level 1, which is the second row up from the bottom. And we see that this lands clearly in the high, but it also glances through the median. So here you have kind of a, there can be some discussion. Do we interpret this 8.6 as being something for our own installation or our own environment? Is it going to ultimately land between 7 and 10, or is it going to go as be a much larger range from 0.1 all the way up to 10? And we can, you can have that discussion, and you can have some rules set around, how do you resolve that discrepancy? The best thing to do, of course, is just to combine the two ranges together. And then this also shows how, you can only get a couple, maybe 3 different options for how you interpret this score at that level. But if we come up 2 more levels with threat and environmental metrics defined, then all of a sudden the score changes and we have that 4.2. And because that is very clearly higher in confidence, then we're able to say, yeah, you know what? The range on this is going to be solidly within the 4 camp. Maybe it's a 4.0, maybe it's a 4.6, maybe it's a 4.9, but we know it's solidly going to be in 4. And I picked this example on purpose to show how we would explicitly stop here and not necessarily chase after the supplemental metrics, because in this case, the fictitious example here, we've already decided that 11 bins of action are enough for us to prioritize our vulnerabilities. We don't really need to go out to the decimal level. We've got enough information. And that's part of this whole objective of the risk ruler, right? We could have even backed up to the lower level and said, hey, we're just going to do base and threat. That gets us into 5 different buckets, and that's gracious plenty for what we want to do. But again, the whole goal of the risk ruler here is to show how numeric scores can map down in a consistent way to qualitative scores, and more importantly, show the confidence and certainty that we have around those figures. So in summary, we add a critical layer of context to CVSS scores by visualizing precision, confidence, and maturity. This enhances decision making. It helps tremendously with model sensitivity analysis and other things in the quant camp that we really didn't talk about today, and also supports more transparent and defensible cybersecurity solutions. So at the end of the day, this UC2 risk ruler for CVSS acts as a bridge between precise quantitative scores and qualitative actionable risk insights. And I put all of this stuff together under a Creative Commons license. So as long as you give me credit, you're free to use this in whatever way you see fit. That wraps up the presentation. I know it's early on, but I wanted to make sure we left plenty of time for conversation. And then also, if we just finish up early, that just gives everybody a chance to be a little bit ahead leading into this Tuesday. So I'm going to try and switch over and make sure that I can look at the chat if there are questions there, or you can just shout things out.
I don't see anything in the Discord, Rob.
Okay.
Any questions in the room?
Yeah, we got 8 seconds. 8 seconds is my rule. If you don't speak up within 8 seconds, I'm closing it off.
I have several questions, so
Okay, good.
I'll everyone to a discussion that we can have, and maybe that will, they'll think about it. I've been looking at this for a little while since you shared it with the SIG and asked for feedback, and I think seeing the example finally brought it together for me. Understanding. I thought this was related to not having any trust in your vendors, but really it's comparing those things between. Would you say it's fair that it's comparing the base score from your vendor to the enrichment that you do in your own organization and then making a decision between those?
Exactly. It's not measuring your confidence in your vendor. your vendor only has they only have so much vision, right? They can only see so far and so deep into their supply chain. So it's about the confidence that what the vendor is saying is the same as what you are going to interpret the same vulnerability in situation in your own environment. That makes sense, Nick?
Yeah. Now, we talked a lot about where I'm going to talk later about our implementation guide, the enhanced user guide, where we have this term operationalization. How can this be, and it may be different for every organization, but are you offering any ways to do this in an automated, systematic way, or is this up to the individual organizations and their vulnerability management program to incorporate it?
Yeah, so good question. So the risk ruler itself does not offer automation of CVSS scoring, right? So I know that we are in the SIG working on some advice on how to do that. For instance, ingesting threat intelligence from open sources in order to get to at least that second level of maturity in a very automated way. But what this particular tool is designed to do is to, foster communication so for instance, and you've got an 8.6 vulnerability and you have an auditor breathing down your neck saying, why aren't you taking care of this vulnerability? Why aren't you patching this thing? And you're like, okay, look, that's really not what that is in our environment because we have all these things, and you can break this risk roller out and begin to have that conversation about, look, here's why from the vendor standpoint it falls into this high category because they can't see all these other metrics that we can see. And as you pile those metrics on, then your ability to narrow down and become much more precise with a score for your organization comes clearly there. And so, as much as anything, it's to help communicate in situations like that where people don't quite understand why you'd have two scores and how do those relate to one another. Make sense?
That's a great suggestion. I think, like you said, this is a great framework for having discussions about CVSS enrichment, about understanding how vulnerabilities impact individual environments. That's, yeah.
Absolutely. And and it drives funding discussions as well, because to ingest the base score doesn't really cost a whole lot, right? Because this score is given by the vendor essentially for free, right? You download it off the internet and you use it. But to incorporate the threat metrics, now you have to spend a little more time or effort trying to, rejigger the score or rescore the vulnerability for yourself. And then when you get into environmental, you're putting a substantial amount of effort into that. Well, all of that has a cost with it. And essentially what you're doing with this is you're showing leadership. You're like, look, if you just want me to go on a high, medium, a low basis, great, I can do that. But if you want me to get more nuanced and better and provide a much more well-oiled vulnerability program, we need to step up our level of confidence in the scores and not just relying on the vendor score, but on scores that are tailored to our environment. And I think that story gets spoken here quite well.
Yeah, it's a very, very good visual aid. We have a question in the room. We're running a mic over. One moment.
Sure.
Um, so I'm thinking how I'd frame
Well,
the
I think
question.
that
Can you hear me?
good.
I can.
On the base level, second row up on the chart that's shown on the screen,
Mhm.
I may have missed it as you were describing this. Can you explain the meaning behind the colors and the overlap? How medium is overlapping with high and low? Is that just the lack of confidence as you described it in kind of the subjectivity of where that score might land without the added attributes from the layers above?
Yes, yes, exactly. It's a nod to a couple of different things. All of that, it's a nod to there's a when you're using numeric scores, and 1/10 of a point is enough to switch something from a 2 to a 3. That's called boundary sensitivity, and so it causes a lot of angst around people that are very rigid with the way they interpret math. um, and so this is kind of a nod to that situation, like, right, like you can't have a precise boundary if you don't have a whole lot of confidence that that score has enough. Like if you think about a target, like a archery target, right? Like if you don't have enough rings to clearly define what the bullseye is, and you've just got a blank circle out there that you're shooting at, it's kind of hard to figure out where the bullseye is. And so it's kind of that concept that's being baked in here. Does that answer your question? Am I going in the right direction for you?
Yes, got a thumbs up.
Okay, great.
We had a discussion yesterday, closing remarks from some of the organizers about the vulnerability ecosystem, the vulnerability disclosure, vulnerability management, vulnerability ecosystem. And how do you think this fits into the vulnerability management or vulnerability disclosure ecosystem and can help with the deluge of information and possibly the unreliability of information that's available from vendors that is trying to be used by individual organizations to make these risk-based decisions?
Yeah, so I think this again is really a communication tool. This is what the UC2 risk ruler for CVSS is. It's a way to say, okay, here's what the vendors are providing. It's kind of um, a not super granular kind of score, but we can start adding things on. And so like threat intelligence, like if you're just pulling in your vendor scores and you're not adding any threat intelligence on top of it, you're kind of doing yourself a disservice. And this is a good example of saying, okay, if we want to move our level of confidence up so that we're not just doing high, medium, and low, but we're doing 5 levels of quantitative binning, it starts to justify that additional expense, and it kind of paints the direction for where your organization needs to go. In fact, I wish I had a slide up here right now that I don't have, which is one that traces a score like the 4.2 down through each level. And it actually creates almost like a hurricane cone, like a tracking cone, right? It's saying that, look, if you really want to know where the eye of that storm is going to pass, then you need to have a lot more confidence than you do on a weather report that's like 6 days out or 7 days out. You need the kind of confidence that you've got in 24 hours or 8 hours of storm warning. And what is that going to take? So from that standpoint, I think this risk ruler will help the larger ecosystem sit down and have these critical discussions to say, what is the level of confidence that we need to get to in these scores, working with the vendors and maturing that score so that we can make sure that we're making really good decisions out in the field. Decisions not just about not getting hacked, but also good financial decisions as well.
So one more question.
Cool.
One more question from the room, but
All right.
yes, and you are saying the dirty R word, but
I'm sorry.
You're
I'm sorry.
forgiven for now.
It's baked into me.
Thanks, Rob, for the presentation. It certainly does open up for consumers, and I come from the producer side as a vendor.
Yeah.
My question comes from, you're helping narrow down into those impact ratings, risk ratings of a vulnerability. Do you have any concern with vendors, and we are one such vendor that assigns their own criticality on their scores when they send them out in an advisory? So, well, Cisco, we will say it's an 8.6 and we'll say it's a high, but then
Yep.
along to the risk ruler puts it down. Do you feel that the vendor is doing a disservice by slapping one of those risk words on that score, or do you still think there's value in having that, despite the risk ruler most likely showing it being lower once all of the efficacy is put into it from a consumer?
No, I think honestly, you get a lot of transparency in your numbers, because if you, just like in this example here, like if you as a vendor tell me you've got a vulnerability that you've scored it as an 8.6, I know that you've done that based on a reasonable worst case scenario, right? Which, may not be the scenario that I'm faced with. And the reason I'm not faced with that is because I've got all these other controls. I've got, 7 layers of firewall. I got jump hosts. I got all these other things in place to help mitigate the situation. So, what you're saying here with, if you published your 8.6 and you put it on this risk ruler, you're saying, look, this is most likely going to be in a high bucket, meaning it could go from 10 to from 7 to 10, but the reality is, if you will look more closely at your environment, you might be able to drag that thing down to a 1. But it puts the burden back on. So it puts the burden back on your customer base to take responsibility for their own deployment, right? And it also gives you, and I hate to say the even dirtier word, the lawyers, the ability to say, you know what, we did come out with this score, but we gave the guidance of this risk ruler alongside of it. So, just because we said that it was a 5 and it turns out that it was a really nasty vulnerability for one particular client, we say, look, yeah, we said it was a medium, but you see here, the range could have been anywhere between 0.1 and 8.9. And if the client didn't do their due diligence, then we're not responsible for the outcome of that. So, just I think the lawyers would appreciate this as much as anybody else, I guess.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
He just asked if there's anything else you wanted to share before we wrap.
No, other than, again, I have posted the underlying papers behind this, as well as a slide deck on Discord. They're actually out on the website as well, on the first website and my website, Acorn Pass. I'm available for birthdays, bar mitzvahs, wherever you need some entertainment. And I really appreciate everybody's time today.